Welcome to the Speak Like a Leader podcast with John Bates. Welcome to the show. With me today is someone who I think you will find to be irreverent and funny and very interesting. The New York press accuses Don Schmincke of providing the most provocative view of leadership than any other speaker. And what else would you expect from an MIT and Johns Hopkins researcher who was nearly arrested as a capitalist spy in the Soviet Bloc, who got shot off an aircraft carrier, and yes, he was in a plane, and who survived in the Kurdish capital as Iran took the U.S. embassy hostages, and was the first white person invited into an African Tsonga tribe, summited 20,000 feet on the highest volcano before it blew up, and I guess he was not there when it blew up, and developed missile guidance systems while his frat brothers took Vegas, as seen in the movie 21. So yeah, Don, you've had a storied and checkered career so far, and I'm really happy to have you. Our conversation that we had before this convinced me that you would be a lot of fun to talk to. So welcome to speaklikealeader.show.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're my pleasure. So let's talk, it is called Speak Like a Leader. So let's talk about, let's start out with leadership communications. I think you've got some interesting takes on leadership and on communication. And, I'll start us off by just saying that I have an equation that I came up with, and I'm very proud of that as a soft skills guy. It's L equals F of C. Leadership is a function of communication. And I think great leadership is a function of great communication. And I wonder if you would agree or disagree with that position.
Yeah, I mean, communication is how you're going to express what you're doing and where you're going and why you're going there. And if you don't do a good job of that, then what are we following?
Well, you invented the concepts of mindset and find your why over 50 years ago. So, having a great mindset and finding your why, if you don't communicate it, it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah. And the work at the Pacific Institute, because Lou Tice 50 years ago, actually, he got started about 20 years before me. I started about 30 years ago.
Okay.
Old. But it
wild.
was where that whole thing came out, find your why and mindset. And so his early work and working with some brilliant people, as I love doing too. So I'm fortunate enough to have some, great people around me that I admire. He found that there was a lot going on before neuroscience became a thing. He was, talking to people that were opening up those gates. So it's staying power, I think, is a testimony to the whole power of it all, because it's not like a flavor of the month fashion trend item. It's like 50 years and still growing. So mindset's now becoming part of our language. So what Lou invented was amazing. And so I'm really honored that the Pacific Institute has brought me on as a research partner to sort of try to continue that whole area. And I'm trying my best. And so far, it looks like we're making more progress. So that's great.
Well, tell us a little bit about your work as an explorer and a scientist and a researcher and all of that.
Well, I never meant to be doing this because I was at MIT doing planetary physics and different sciences in the early stages of AI. And then I automated the Harvard MIT biomedical lab, and I started looking at our species in a different way.
Yeah.
It took me to Johns Hopkins, and I began looking at how humans group. And in the executive MBA program, a lot of managers were complaining about all these great management theories that don't implement. In other words, they're not driving their sales higher. They're not driving their efficiencies the way they want it. So I went to look at failure rates of management theory. And it led me into it because I was just a geek scientist. I didn't know anything about this stuff. I just entered into it like a new area of exploration. What was cool about it is I began to uncover incredible high failure rates of a lot of management theories, but then it led me to look at why. And that's when I began to realize we may be teaching leadership wrong in a lot of different areas. And so when we started correcting how it was taught, companies actually could measure a doubling or a tripling of their sales, in some cases 10 times their sales revenues within a few years, or their the internal issues could reduce by at least half within 3 to 4 months. So we were able to see by their own measurement results. And so all we were doing was just uncovering what was already there in our evolution. So it wasn't
Right.
like I had any new great ideas. I was just hanging out with some brilliant people who were teaching me how
Well,
humans work.
hey, the good place to be, man. That's a good place to be.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I mean, I guess you can't give us all your secrets, but can you tell us some of the ways that you saw that we're teaching leadership wrong, and give us an idea of what correcting that looked like?
Yeah, like one area was I would I would see leaders that after they died, people would tell who they were really, and a
Uh,
lot of them were assholes.
yeah.
So
There is that, right?
and I think Forbes, I think even wrote an article on do you have to be a jerk to be a CEO or something? But they went through
Right.
this whole list. But I was looking at like when Apple started implementing our research through our colleague Cameron Logman on our samurai work. And Steve Jobs died, and so they want to know about innovation, and so that's how this stuff started getting implemented at Apple. But I read books and about what they said about him. He was like a jerk. I'm thinking, wait a minute, this guy violated everything we're teaching in management school.
Right.
So how does he create the most powerful company in the world? Shouldn't
Right.
that be a course? I
Yeah.
mean, shouldn't it be like the first course? How does a
Yeah.
guy create the most powerful company in the world, violating what we teach in leadership? And I thought I was curious why no one asked that question before. So I thought,
Yeah.
why don't we ask it? Right? I'm just a geek scientist. I'm just trying to figure this
Yeah.
out. And it turned out that one of the reasons I think some of our leadership techniques don't work is we are teaching basics like followers follow leaders, and I found out that's not true. Followers don't follow leaders; they follow what you're actually talking about. They follow the story the leader represents,
Yeah. Oh, huge. Yes.
and I saw that. So I no one, and I'm not saying that you got to be an asshole to have a story. What I'm
I'm
saying is
kind of
that,
glad. I just want to clarify that. Like it doesn't, that was not necessarily a necessary ingredient, right?
yeah, right, right. So I don't want I always tell my audiences what I'm doing. I'm not telling you to be an asshole, although I may be late for a couple of you. I'm just
Right.
saying,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so, but what I think I'm hearing that I think is that's really, really important is even in the face of kind of being a jerk, because the story he represented was so
yes,
powerful and so compelling,
yes,
his personal flaws, whatever they might have been, were beaten out by how powerful that story is. And that's
yes.
certainly, one of the things that's right up my alley is just that is the power of story, right?
Yep, that's it. And he could communicate it. He could
And
communicate it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love talking about Steve Jobs in that vein because a lot of people called him the natural communicator, right?
Mhm.
Like that was what they called him. And I have a dear friend who worked with him very closely for a long, long time and worked with him on all those great speeches he gave. And what I had no idea of is that after they created the speech, which certainly took long enough, Steve Jobs would commit to practicing that speech for an hour for every minute that he was going to be on stage. Okay,
Wow.
you'd be a natural communicator too if you worked that hard, right? Like we call him a natural communicator because we don't want to work as hard as he worked.
Right. Right. Yeah. And
But and S- s-
Uh, no, you just reminded me of that old saying, like it takes 15 years to become an overnight sensation, right? And
Right.
it's
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's easy to become an overnight success when you've been doing it for 15 years. Well, and the other thing that my friend said, um, which I thought was just so brilliant and I had never really considered before, was thank you, baby. My latte just arrived.
nice.
Thanks. So he felt like those speeches at Macworld every year were one of the most important components of Apple's success because when Steve walked into the room, they knew they had people assigned seating, right? Like, so all the fanboys were right here and all the detractors were over there and all the, the other group was here. And he knew exactly what portion of the spectrum he was talking to in the room. So he would deliver the good stuff to the fanboys and he would, speak to the detractors and whatever. But the thing was that speech had to happen on that day. And it was going to be heard around the world by everybody who was anybody. And it was Steve's chance to rally everybody behind his vision. So the stockholders heard it, the news people heard it, the employees heard it. They had to have the product ready by that time. So there was no feature creep and we'll put it out later and later and later. And that whole thing he thought was one of the most powerful driving forces behind Apple's success.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which lines up with I think exactly with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we see that a lot. I mean, when I went back into looking at other people, I mean, like just General Patton, I mean, he was an asshole, but people followed him, even at the cost of life because of what he represented. And they just published, like, Mother Teresa was an asshole. Like, what? Mother Teresa? But, you can Google it. It was just like these things come out and you're like, well, what are they following? And I think we should teach leaders, like, they're not really following you. They're following that story that you represent, and how you communicate it is part of the representation. Now, it's okay to do that, but let's make sure it's strategic. That's the other part too, is it's okay to have whatever we want to call our mission, our purpose, our why, et cetera. But if it doesn't make strategic sense, you're going to be another autopsy of a dead company that had a great why statement.
Yeah.
So
Right.
another thing I think we're missing is when I started doing autopsies, because that's where I really discovered a lot of this stuff. It wasn't studying successful companies; it was the ones that died. Like, why did they die?
Yeah.
Is their communication didn't index to any sort of strategic winning formula. And when I did actually, because I've trained about 30,000 CEOs, and if somebody told me that, I thought, you got to be kidding. And then they said, Don, you're getting old. You've been doing this for a long time. And when I wrote the book, Winners and Losers, that was a really key piece in the book from that research that, a lot of dead companies are executing all those management theories very well. It's just they're dead. And so I think we're teaching leadership wrong, because they shouldn't have died. If they had thought about strategy first, what does winning mean and how are we going to do it? Then your communication becomes more powerful, because then it can result in something.
So are you saying that they may have a great why, but they just didn't have a great plan? Is that kind of, or they didn't even really know the objective? Like on a like, what does it look like in the world basis?
Yeah, they didn't have a strategy for winning.
Well,
they had tactics for winning, but they didn't have a strategy for winning. So
I will plead guilty to that myself, because my why. I got to talk to Simon Sinek at TED one year, and just he was just there, and we talked for like 45 minutes. He's a great guy. I love him, and he's also a hero of mine, and he helped me with my why. And so my why is to bring out what's awesome inside every person so it can live in the world and make a real difference. And I've got some tactics around how I'm doing that. And I do work with, like I've trained the astronauts in Yay. And I mean, that was bucket list for me. I pinch myself, but I don't really have a strategy for like how I'm going to get to everybody. Right.
Yeah, because
So
you're a teacher at heart, and that's what you're expressing. Putting it into a business model is a whole different thing
yeah,
because
totally. Yeah.
that's where strategy is needed. And like when I was teaching at Johns Hopkins, one of the things I saw when I was in the graduate school, I had a lot of access to some really, really great material and resources. I noticed that these small companies would start up and the leaders would be chastised. They would say they're not doing it right, they're never going to make it, they're going to fail. And somehow this leader grew a company to dominate their entire market. And and then all of a sudden all the thought leader expert consultants shut up and stop blaming them. Stop
Yeah.
chastising them. But my question was, how does a company that violates best practices, that violates what we teach, dominate the planet? And by the planet, I mean their markets. And I
Yeah.
found out that coming back to our conversation here, strategy is what they had.
Yeah.
Most companies don't have strategy; they have tactics. And so therefore, they can easily be outmaneuvered by a company that has a real strategy because we did more research into this, like why are we using tactics? And it's because we're using analysis. And that's a
Yeah.
problem because analysis isn't strategy. Analysis, and I was part of the problem. I was part of the problem. I was teaching classes on analysis, market
Yeah.
analysis, SWOT analysis. You got to do a good SWOT analysis and this
Yeah.
analysis. And then at the end of the day, it was all bullshit because there were companies outmaneuvering companies that did all that well. And what they were doing is they weren't doing a SWOT analysis. They were intuiting something differently. They were seeing their beliefs which would shift like what Lou Tyson invented. The mindset was shifted. They saw the world differently. They saw winning differently. They saw how to outmaneuver the enemy, and they did it. And they did it in a way where the enemy didn't even know they were being outmaneuvered until it was
Right.
too late. You know,
Yeah.
when I first published my book back in the '90s, The Code of the Executive, it was it was a bestseller in these CEO micro markets, and there was a couple of uh, publisher distributors that were like, "Oh, Amazon never going to make it. Geez, we're selling books, and the margins we have to make, he's not making it. They're not
Yeah.
going to make it.
Yeah.
They're going to." And that was it. Now,
Yeah.
now, of course, they shut up, but.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what happened? I mean, these are the questions we should be teaching in leadership. These are, ponder these questions and formulate what's really going on. So anyway, that's a long answer to your
No, no, no. No, I like it. I mean, I appreciate the insights that these stories give. And I think there's already been so many quotable quotes here. The latest one I would say is analysis is not strategy,
right.
right? Like it can be important on the tactical level, but what's the bigger strategy and what are your competitors doing that you may not even be thinking about if you're just on a tactical level and not thinking strategically and big picture enough, right? Like these publishers who are like, "Are you kidding? He's not making margins, you know?"
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
well, but
Right.
he didn't need to because he's doing something else.
Right. And you need the tactics later on. You do need, when I
Hmm.
was working at the Pentagon, because they had taken the models that I'm using and to transform fleet warfare readiness. And then we tested it in an experiment called the Gulf War. You might have heard of it.
Yeah,
And so
yeah, yeah.
we were,
I
but
remember that.
but it was in the process that we were able to look at different things, and and intuition is. I mean, I learned something from them. Well, I learned a lot of things. One of the things is you could be tactically excellent. You could execute perfectly your tactics, but if your strategy is flawed, you're going to lose the war.
Well, you totally,
Yeah.
yeah.
But if you have great strategy, you can make any number of tactical errors and still pull it off and win.
Yeah. That is that's a not super obvious, but really, really good point. And intuitively, it feels very correct once I hear it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll make an analogy to speaking. There's a woman who's a speaker coach who says that the audience will never forgive you for being boring. That's the one thing they'll never forgive you for, right? And I like to say, as long as you are present, really present with the audience will forgive you for anything but
Mm,
being boring,
right.
right? So, if you've got the strategy then you can mess up on the tactics here and there, and you'll still win the battle. But if your tactics are serving a flawed strategy, then you're clearly destined for failure.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the key. And I had to learn that myself because when I started out speaking, I was academic, I had
Mm,
20, 30 things going on, and I wanted to get all
yeah,
this data out there.
you're
And at the end,
right.
it was all bullshit. I mean, it was
Yeah,
just data. I mean, I can read
yeah,
data. Like what's tell me touch me in a certain way. And
yeah,
I got better and better, and I've done like 2,000 speeches, so I'm starting to get the hang of it now.
yeah.
But like one of the people Simon Sinek and I use the same coach, Mark
Yes.
Levy, and
Yeah.
Mark helped me even now, so into my career as speaking, helped me even push it further to look at what is it I'm really doing, and that's where he created the concept winners and losers because by the way, he may be a great guest too for your
Listen,
podcast.
if you'd make the introduction, I'd love to have him. I
Yeah,
would love
yeah,
to hear
because
from him.
he's done a great job with, of course, Simon is historic now, and but many many others.
Yeah.
So, for me, I had to look at what's the real impact. So I think, coming to your point of being present, to communicate as a leader, you have to understand like where is the audience.
Yeah.
Because if you can't touch where they are, you can't bring them to wherever they need to go or you want them to go,
Yeah.
and that's the problem.
Yeah. It has been surprising to me in my career of doing this now for, coming up on 15 years here, uh, how just not the first thing that people think that is, like it's not the first place people go is like, who's in my audience? What's going to really matter to them? How can I really cater this to my audience? And what a huge difference just thinking about that. Like if that's the only thing that somebody got, from their speeches before to their speeches after, to
Hmm.
just really take into account who's in the audience and what's going to actually matter to them. Not what do I want to say or what do I think
Right.
is important or what do I, want them to hear. What's really going to matter to them the most.
Yep.
It's such a minor shift and it's so obvious in hindsight, but it's so non-obvious
Yeah.
until it becomes obvious, right?
Yeah. And it takes a lot of work. I mean, I was asked to speak to a CPA association, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to tell these, right? Because the conferences are on like new regulations, new issues with the government, new this, new that, and I'm thinking I'm talking about whole something else. But when I looked at what they were doing, it allowed me to say, wait a minute, you're actually an underutilized strategic resource. And all of a sudden they got it. It was like, and so let me tell you how you can work with your clients and be more than just a transactional vendor.
Yeah.
And that opened the whole door. And I can now share with them what I learned from training, thousands of CEOs. But it took a lot of work. It's not like you can
Yeah.
just walk in there. Now, if I do the same audience over and over again, yeah, fine. It's like I like doing workshops because when you're speaking to hundreds of people, it's harder to engage in a dialogue. But if I'm in, 20, 15 people in a room, you can start off, hey, what are your main issues and concerns? And just put them up on the flip chart. You're
Yeah.
already in now. Now you're
Yeah.
in the space and they're pulling you into what they're doing. So
Yeah.
there are several methods of doing it, but it's not easy. And I think that's why leaders sometimes miss the mark because they don't start with that.
Right. Right. So, there are a number of CPAs and related people in those fields that listen. Uh, Say that again, because I really think that's really a super valuable point.
To assess an audience, you mean before you go in?
Well, no, yes. And what you told specifically, because I know I've got a lot of CPAs listening, tell me again what you told
Oh,
that
cool. Yeah,
audience.
yeah, yeah. I was I needed to figure out that most of my research is in strategic growth of companies and in enhancing organizational performance. Okay, so that takes many different areas of culture,
Yeah.
restructuring, sometimes recapitalization, which I'm not really an expert in, but a lot of people are that are easier to find. And in that, I'm thinking, what can I offer these people? Now, somebody had heard me. That's how I got into this thing. Somebody had heard me speak at another
Right.
conference. They said, you
Yeah.
really need to talk to us. But I
That's how
wasn't sure.
speakers get new gigs, by the way. They have such a good speech that people want them to come give that speech to their group.
Yeah, yeah. So I get referred around a lot, which is great. But I had a thought, this is a different audience. And most of them weren't in the room. It was a national Zoom thing. And I might have had 60 people in the room, and then there were others outside of the room. But it was then that I had to realize what's the connection with this. And that's when I began to look at what are some of the struggles CPAs have.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are, they're seen as transactional relationships. It's
Yes.
like, oh, I got to do my taxes.
Yeah.
Or we have to make this decision on an asset. Well, how is that going to affect the balance sheet? Or what's
Yeah.
my, what's my what's my equity
Yeah.
or revenue per employee? I mean, what's my ratio? So that's fine, but so what? If they could see you as a strategic resource, you now can
Yes.
point out things they may not be asking for.
Yes.
And that was, I thought, that's it. That's where we begin. And it
Yeah.
was great. I got people coming up say, can you speak to my group, this group,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is fine. But I think that by reading the audience, I was able to see where the connection was, and they could see things they may not have seen before. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I know they were a productivity problem. I see it in the numbers, but they
Yeah.
don't ask me to do that. They ask me to file the taxes on time. And
Right.
you should be meeting with the board,
Yeah.
and say, here's your
Yeah.
productivity numbers over the past 5 years. It's going down.
Yeah.
Or you can see things in, what's the return on investment on their PR budget. You
Yeah.
can figure that out.
Yeah.
And these are the issues. And it was really good. I felt good because I could provide, and I'm not sure if all of them are going to do everything, but at least a
Sure.
few I think led up and thought, wow, we are in a position to help we should be on the executive team presenting,
Yeah.
and so it was just one example, but
Yeah.
I
I
had to
mean,
do the
I
same.
love that particular example because a dear friend of mine is Mike Michalowicz, and he wrote the book Profit First, where he talks about how you've got to take the profit out first and hide it from yourself because
Yeah,
otherwise you're just going to eat it all.
yeah,
And so I do a lot of work with CPAs and accounting firms and things like that. And I think you're absolutely right. They are undervalued as a strategic resource. They're just purely used on a tactical basis. And I think, when they get that they can be a real strategic value and they can get their clients to see that, the whole relationship changes. So that's just an example that's particularly close to my heart.
oh,
And so
good,
I love the bigger example and I love the specific example.
good.
So what is another one of the kind of more surprising discoveries that you have come across as you've been exploring this realm of management theories and things like that?
Yeah, let's see, where did I start? There's like 7 dimensions that came out of the autopsy research, and one of the dimensions it was, first you have to have the strategy down, as we've
Yeah.
discussed. 'Cause once you have the strategy for what winning means and how we're going to do it, now that allows you to create your why and your purpose in a way that will
Yes.
make a difference in market penetration and sales growth and all that. But the other area was communicating it internally into the companies, and we found out that a lot of times we're teaching about mission statements and purposes, and we think like that's enough. We found out it's not. I mean, because we found a lot of dead companies where they had great why statements and great purposes. What was missing is we aren't galvanizing humans to doing 2 things that we don't teach because it's politically incorrect, but I find that more fascinating. So we
Yeah.
teach it anyway. And that is that the greatest organizations and civilizations had people that were willing to galvanize around something ahead where they needed each other. They needed each other, and they were willing to suffer and to sacrifice together. Now, you
I
never
love
see
that.
that in a mission statement. You never see that in a why statement, and I think it should be there. So, but we came up with a different statement. We called it a compelling saga. We said, your statements are great, keep them, but we stole it from the Vikings. If you
Yeah.
don't have a compelling saga, something ahead that needs to be conquered, that you need each other. You can't do it alone. And we're willing to suffer and sacrifice together. That's the communication. That's the
That's,
rallying cry. That's what we should teach.
and Don, my dad, who has passed about a year ago, and I miss him terribly. He was a Marine, and he was one of those, like, every molecule of his body was a Marine, even after he was out of the Corps. He got wounded in Vietnam and got an honorable medical discharge, but he never left the Corps, take the man out of the Marine Corps, but you can't take the Marine Corps out of the man. And, one of the things that I really loved about his style of communication and what I understood of the Marine Corps style of communication is that there's no sugarcoating it,
Right.
It's like, look, we're going to take this island and not all of us are going to make it. And it is, here's how we're outmanned. Here's how we're outgunned. Here's how, and this is how we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And dude, people be like, and go do it. And I think that, Brene Brown, she talks about that too. Like, we were built to struggle. Like, life for most of our history as a species was a heck of a lot harder, And I think that shared willingness to suffer and sacrifice for a greater good is probably, that being such a missing is probably a huge contributor, if not maybe the major contributor, to a lot of our political dysfunction and our social dysfunction and our mental health problems and all of that.
It's true. And it goes against the grain, though, because when when I'm in audiences, and I'll bring it up, I'll say, I know there's a big movement out there for happy employees, and there's a lot of books and speakers out there, and that's great. But I think we went a little overboard on the happy employee movement. And I never get pushback on that. Everybody's like, thank God, somebody's
saying it. Yeah.
And I said, it's so out of that research, what we found out is that people, everybody wants a happy employee. That's great. But we're doing it wrong because if you're going to go on to take a new market, or you're going to go through the struggle, as you mentioned, or you're an entrepreneur, like in my book, I love the case studies when I found in the research. Their struggle, it wasn't easy. It was a lot of failure and mistakes and learning from those failures, and so it was a lot of pain. And I find that you're going to go into this. And I don't care if you're a small or big company. I don't care if you're an entrepreneur or you're running a Fortune level company. It's, there's a struggle there, and you have a choice. You can choose from one or two teams. The one team is the team that their ego's out of the way. They know how to die for the cause. They know how to suffer and sacrifice, and they're going to operate from bravery and honor. You have this other team that just wants to be happy. Which one are you going to choose?
Right. Yeah. Certainly the first.
It's like,
right.
What?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it becomes clear, like, oh my God. Because the second thing that came out of the research is, what makes employees really happy? Winning. Winning makes employees happy.
Yeah.
And you get to see this. And I think that's the area of leadership teaching and communication we need to shift from to, everybody's got to be happy and inspired. That's great. But I think it's better to take on a cause.
Yeah.
And be willing to suffer and sacrifice for it.
And Don, I think that if you really, I think it's because people have a surface level understanding of happiness. And I don't think that pampered equals happy, right? And easy does not equal truly happy, right? I think that when people are with people they care about, working on something that's bigger than themselves, and being really pushed to their limits, not far beyond their limits, right? But being challenged, then people start to really come alive. And I think a lot of the positive psychology research would back you up on this willingness to suffer and sacrifice, quote unquote, for something that's greater than yourself with a team that you respect and care about. That's about as fulfilled as we get, I think,
Right.
And if you look at how we live for most of our history, it was in small groups that were struggling to survive. And, it was family groups and somewhat larger. And so, that's what we evolved to want to do.
Yeah, and it's natural. You're right on it because that is what has to, I think, be taught to
Yeah.
leaders today is
Yeah.
don't forget this piece
Yeah.
because when you forget about it, like I've done enough autopsies to be able to see this, and it's how we're, it's a weird way as we're developing leadership. Like another area that I've had to put into my speeches is, we're teaching leadership about style. But
Yeah.
style of leadership changes every 1,000 years. And I go back like 10,000 years and what was leading us,
I love it.
the
Yeah.
gods, calling
Yeah.
us forward to
Yes.
new lands. And then we get into machine organizations because of Isaac Newton and the Newtonian physics and then this
Yeah.
and that. So that's one of the things that we're forgetting is that I think as you lead, it's not about style because every year there's a new book on style. Well, we
Yeah.
have to be this style leader. Oh, we have to be a
Yeah.
servant leader. We have to be
Yeah.
a participative leader. We have to be a
Right.
collaborative leader. We have to do
Uh-huh.
this and lead. And it's like every freaking book, there's a style thing. Are we a level 4? Level 5? What are we doing?
Yeah.
I find so many dead companies with style books on their shelves,
Yeah. Right.
to which then says, well, why did they die? They died because of lack of speed.
Speed.
They could not adapt quick enough.
Yeah.
So I think leadership should be communicated and taught in a way that says, look, we we know what winning means. We know how we're going to do it. Now, how can we do it fast? How can we adapt fast? How can we learn fast? How can we fail fast? It's all about speed of execution of our strategy. Then you ask the second question, what style of leadership supports that? And I've
Yeah.
never seen that published in any book.
Maybe that's your next book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I can easily see that. It reminds me of the conversation about culture, which I think a lot of people have, they think it's a little airy fairy and a little loosey goosey and a little,
Mhm.
California woo woo. But I think, and listen, I don't think there's a lot of controversy to this statement. I think most people would agree with me, but I think culture eats strategy for lunch 7 days a week
Mhm.
because strategy is going to arise out of culture.
Yeah.
Culture is where that's going to come from in the first place. And I think stories, to loop back to where we began, I think stories are the myths that create the mythology that is the culture of the company. And I think good storytelling by the leaders about values and principles that matter to them and that they want to infuse into the culture, that those stories are one of your most direct ways to access and alter and impact company culture.
And I think it's interesting. It's almost like a cycle because there's an evolution. Because in some senses you see revolutions in countries and in companies sometimes that come from the cultural element that's there, and then there's times where that culture is no longer helpful.
Yeah.
And you can look at various war elements because one of the people that I'm really privileged to know is like George Stock, who's done some amazing articles in Harvard Business Review, and he started the lean manufacturing revolution. As and we're doing some other projects. I'm just really blessed to have these people want to
It's so
want to
great.
hang
It's
out
it's
with me. You
nice
know what
to
I mean?
hang
So,
out with a bunch of
so
smarter people than you.
right, and
So
he
it
could tell
means
you.
you're doing something right.
Yeah, yeah, and he would sit there and go through certain battle or war learnings of humans in
Hmm.
battle with
Yeah.
each other, as to what happened and what kind of cultures stopped them from adapting. Like they
Yeah.
needed to change their culture. So sometimes it's like, okay, once you got winning, what does it mean, and how are you going to do it? Does your culture support it? Like we had a high tech company once that was very successful, and they grew to a certain point, and then they stopped. They started hitting competition, and they had a
Yeah.
culture that was more of the customer's always right, and we'll do everything for the customer, which actually works until it doesn't.
Yeah.
And what happened is competition
Interesting.
was coming in. Now they had to figure out, well, not everybody's our customer anymore. What's
Yeah.
our target market? and who should
Yeah.
we say no to? And that
Yeah.
was a major shift of culture for them because they had
Well,
never
I
experienced it.
could easily imagine that's a tough shift of
Very,
culture.
very tough. Then you have to change things, which now let's talk about culture change failure rates. As you probably know, 70 to 90% of culture efforts failed to change the culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So we had a lot of autopsies on that. And here's what I found was really interesting. It gets back to what you said earlier. We've been doing this for thousands of years. Our species, we got a couple million years of programming.
Yeah.
And yet, when went in to turn around a failed culture program, we've done a number of these, what was consistently happening, and we've done this 100 times, they forgot to trigger tribal human grouping instincts. And that's why the culture change effort failed. And because biologically, as you mentioned, we are still operating this way. And yet, for some reason, these culture change experts, these culture change thought leaders forget to acknowledge our biology in the change effort. So then,
Yes.
when you go back and look at their history of successes, it's marginal.
Yeah.
It's marginal. So we were
I
able
could.
to turn
Yeah.
that around. Go
That's
ahead.
great. So what would be one example of a way that you could trigger that human grouping instinct? Do you mind sharing?
Well, fortunately, the anthropologists that I started hanging around with that let me into their club I was able to find out from them
Yeah, you've gotten
what's
into
going
some
on here.
really cool clubs.
Yeah, I know. I'm really fortunate. I sort of sneak in and then they kick
Yeah.
me out, but I try to learn as
Hey
much as I
man.
can while I'm there. But it's really interesting because when I look at everything from me, like Dr. David Buss, I've been talking to him over the past few years. He started the whole evolutionary psychology thing, runs the laboratory out of Austin now. I love these people because they share their time with me. I feel really privileged, and I'm just grateful for them doing that. But what came out of the culture thing was very obvious from an anthropological point of view, and that is that we aren't altering what all tribes alter when they want to align or change culture: symbols, rituals, and magic.
Ooh, oof, that's so good.
And when we started doing that, we started having we turned around a 90% failure rate to a 100% success rate.
Yeah.
Now, it
Wow.
was a total
Wow.
flip, and it was surprising to us because I thought, maybe we can make a difference. But when I saw such a dramatic impact, I thought, wow, we should be teaching this. This is what
Yeah.
we should be teaching. And if you think about leadership communication, some of that communication expresses itself not only in words, but in symbology and
Yeah.
rituals, doesn't it?
Yes.
And
Oh my gosh,
so,
you're making me think like I have some good symbols. I have some rituals, but boy, I need more rituals and I got to think about how to build magic into what I do.
yeah,
But symbols, rituals and magic to make culture change succeed. I mean, that is so profoundly brilliant. I just can hardly stand it. I love that.
yeah, but thank you. And it's just what we borrowed from these anthropologists that have been doing
Yeah,
this for decades. And
right.
like, why don't we teach that? So a lot of this science is not incorporated, but it is provable. It's not like a good idea. Does it
Yeah.
transfer? No, we've done this with hundreds of companies, and it's as an example, like we had one I had I was doing a speech and a VP of a bank came up and he says, "Well, we just spent $250,000 in organizational change, thought leader consultants, and total failure." I said, "Wait, John,
Yeah.
he said, we have a 100-year-old culture, and we have to change it from a paternalistic, top-down culture, like it was 100 years ago, to a
Yeah.
branch-driven culture. Total
Yeah.
failure." So I said, "I tell you what, give me a couple of months, and if it doesn't work, I'll give you your money back." And he's like, "You're on, right?" So we
Yeah.
had to turn out what was the symbol of the old regime, and we used an ancient Roman technique because the Romans knew a few things about
They
culture change. All right,
they knew a few things. Yeah,
I
they
mean
certainly did. Yes.
they had a rapid merger and acquisition campaign going on, so they
All the time. Yeah.
they had to figure it out. And here's what we found out is that it could be a symbol of the old regime, which ended up being the assigned parking place. So with a spray can and a screwdriver and whatever, we dismantled the parking spaces, and
Yeah,
it
I
it
love
kicked off
these.
a
I
dramatic
love that.
change program. Oh, it's And it was funny. One time I had like I'll do this workshop inside companies, so
Uh-huh.
I'll do it in audiences that are multi-industry and all that. That's great.
Yeah.
But sometimes CEO says, "Can you do this inside my company?" Which is great for me because now I get a new laboratory, right?
Yeah, 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 right.
So
Yeah.
I did this day workshop, and the next day, a VP of HR calls in a panic, says, "Don, you gotta call Frank. He's gone nuts. He's got a crowbar and he's tearing shit off the walls." I'm like, I'm like,
Perfect.
so I'm
So,
like,
yeah,
put him on.
no,
I'm like, Frank, what's up,
encourage
doing?
him. Yeah.
Just, nobody. I was like, what's happening? He says, Don, it was great to get everybody in the room. They heard this research, this model, and we got stuff on the table we needed to get out on the table and actions to handle it and all this other stuff. But I couldn't figure out why are they resisting TikTok? I'm running an advertising firm, and here I'm always pushing and getting resistance. When Instagram came out, now with TikTok, I feel like I'm always pushing this thing. And I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning and realized symbols on the main hallway I have hanging up on the wall, the awards we have won for our Yellow Pages advertising. Pulls up,
That is so funny.
pops the trunk, crowbar comes out. He starts, I tell you, destroying those symbols had more of an impact than any speech he could have given
Yeah.
or any posters he could have hung up on the wall.
Yeah.
But sometimes communication is more than just words. Sometimes
Oh,
it
it's way
requires
more.
destruction of symbols or
Yeah.
rituals. So this is exciting stuff, but it's from using it. I mean, I wouldn't be teaching this if we weren't able to see case study results where it actually worked,
Yeah.
and we're willing to put our
Wow.
money on it.
I want to hire you for the United States to do some culture change with some good symbols and rituals and magic that kind of gets us back to a little bit more cooperative and a little bit less nasty. And
Yeah.
I think it's a big project.
That would be nice to do. I mean, but fortunately, we have examples, but we're not teaching those I mean, like,
Yeah.
when you look at
Let's
the
talk
founding of
about
the
it.
country, the founding of the country, we had a story, and it's funny in my blog. Oh my God, I'm going to be politically incorrect here. Um,
Please. Yeah,
the-
it's okay.
because it's like, well, people want authenticity. People want authenticity. It's like the top. I read an article yesterday somewhere. Surveys show this is like one of the top words, and I'm thinking, bullshit.
Yeah.
So I'm going to repost my blog, or I put in there the history of America, the founding of us. All of our founding fathers getting together in this room and signing this Declaration of Independence against the king, and
Yeah.
and that never happened because when I went back, and I wasn't the first one. Like, who was it who wrote the Legends, Lies, and Myths of American History? But I went back to the Library of Congress. It's actually in the Library of Congress.
Uh-huh.
Like only two people signed it, like John Hancock and Charles Thompson, I think the secretary. It took
Uh-huh.
years to get all the signatures because nobody wanted to. Over half didn't want to succeed from the king.
Yeah.
This was not
Yeah.
a thing. And
Yeah.
so, and we got the date wrong. It was on July 2nd, I think. It wasn't July 4th. And John Adams wrote to his wife that on the 3rd, that yesterday would be the most important day in America. Later on, somebody found the letter and changed it to fit the 4th. The
Oh,
whole thing was not authentic.
that's wow.
But the point is, so what? We needed a story, and
Yeah.
this is a story which we will celebrate, and
Yeah.
we will enjoy, and we'll have hot dogs, and we'll rally around the story.
Well,
But so I think the leader sometimes is like, how many of these stories aren't true? And
yeah.
and it's funny because you look at some of these founding companies, and there's these myths about the company, and the
Yeah.
founder's like, that didn't happen.
Yeah, right.
It's like, well, don't say anything. It's a great so I think we
Yeah.
live by myths, and it's okay because it pulls us together and it makes it work. And like we're the only country founded with a national anthem founded on a war that we lost.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
I mean, it's like Fort
Uh,
McHenry, and we lived down the street from Fort McHenry. Yeah, we were out there and the cannons firing, but the reason we were being attacked was because we were attacking Canada. We were attacking a British colony. So they were, and we lost because we had to withdraw from Canada. So anyway,
Right.
I
That's
I just have fun with this because it's like, hey, look, let's lighten up a little bit, and
yeah.
let's look at what moves us as humans, and let's just make it happen. And because um, leadership is about intuition
Yeah.
more than analysis.
Yeah.
And when you go back, we have to give ourselves some room. Can we organize ourselves to win? That's
Yeah.
what's important, right? How many
Yeah.
times do you see a movie with a sports team underdog come back and win the season?
Right. Yeah.
What's the coach doing? Teaching more analysis? And no.
No. No, yeah. No, it's inspiration, it's intuition. Yeah. I agree. And I do give people when I do my trainings, I give them a poetic license. So, I tell them don't use this for the dark side of the force. Only use this for good,
Yes, right.
but you don't have to tell the whole story. And if you get things a little out of order, it's okay, right? Like as long as it's fundamentally true, then good enough, here's your poetic license.
Exactly. And if you look at what's going on today, unfortunately, but it's a really live case study we're experiencing now.
Oh
You've
boy,
got
is it.
Ukraine, Russian conflict, right,
Yeah.
and Hamas and Israel, right?
Yep.
Those are story wars.
Yeah.
You look at each party involved, and they have
So-
a story about the other party.
yeah.
Now, is it all true? Probably not,
No.
but it's galvanizing people to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned let's not use it for the dark side, but
Ugh.
that's what's
It-
happening.
well, the dark side knows how to use this stuff already. I mean, it's one of my really driving forces behind my passion is that I feel like the dark side already has all these tools, and the
Yeah.
dark side
Yeah.
uses these tools with wild abandon.
Mm.
And so many people on the good side of the force actually shy away from these tools because
Mhm.
they've seen them used by the dark side. But that
Mhm.
lightsaber, if Yoda's holding that lightsaber, it can do a lot of good.
Yeah.
And so I want to get that lightsaber into the hands of the good people, because
Yeah.
the dark
Yeah.
side's already swinging,
Yeah, it's funny, but I think going back to your point, I mean, if you look at our biology, you look at where we came from, how we've evolved over millions of years, we begin to see sometimes the most simple and effective way to organize ourselves to win. And I think that's the whole point. And whenever and it's still fresh in my mind now because the book just came out, Winners and Losers. But what I found is that most of the winners had a history of losses and mistakes.
Yeah.
We like to think, oh, they did this right, did that right, did that right. No, no, no. When I went back, they did this wrong, did that wrong, did that wrong. So I think we should be offering a new story to ourselves to lose powerfully. We should train each other to lose more powerfully.
Boy, I
Because,
couldn't agree more. I think you're totally right. I think you're totally right. I have failed big in my life, and I certainly learned more from that than I did
Mhm,
from my successes. And I think that the successes that I have had were owe a lot to the failures
mhm.
that I've had,
Yeah, yeah.
So listen, I've kept you a little bit past the top of the hour, so
That was
I
fast.
will. Yeah, it certainly went fast. I would love to have you come back.
Sure.
I think there's more to talk about, and I just really love talking with you, Don.
Great.
So,
Thank you. Me too.
is there anything I should have asked you or didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that you'd like to say before we go?
No, just I think keep doing what you're doing. I mean, certainly this is the leadership issue, and I I love you having me on. If people want to follow me more, they can go to sagaleadership.com because I based it on a story, Saga. I
Yes.
stole it from the Vikings because they knew how to do story. You know what?
Yes, 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 they did. Yeah. So,
So
and
yeah,
you
that's
know,
it.
yeah, I forgot to, I'm so glad. Thanks for mentioning it. It's Saga Leadership,
Right.
SAGALEADERSHIP.com,
Yeah.
sagaleadership.com. And was there a link to your book there too, Don?
Yeah, I think we should have it there. Yeah, and it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, so it's being distributed everywhere. People want to
Winners
get
and
that.
losers.
Yeah, Winners and Losers, and it's a short book. I made it an easy read, and
I love
it,
that you did that.
yeah, yeah, and for some reason it got number one on entrepreneurial management in Amazon for about 15 milliseconds. I'm not sure if it's still there. It's like
Well,
every minute, but
congratulations. It's
it
a
was,
number one bestseller.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. We used to have, like, what did Andy Warhol say? Everybody gets 15 minutes of fame. But in
Yeah.
this age, I think everybody gets 15 milliseconds of fame.
Yeah, I think you're right. Our attention spans are a lot shorter. Well, so we'll jump back and do part 2 of this in another 6 months or something, because I think this was just a lot of fun, and I wish you the best. And thank you very, very much for joining us here on speaklikealeader.show.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
And thank you for joining us for this conversation. I hope you've found it worth your time, and I certainly hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And we'll see you again next time on speaklikealeader.show. Thank you for joining the Speak Like a Leader podcast. Go be awesome.